Well, you see, because it's oral poetry, if a person says things in a poem against the government, which has often happened recently, it's a one-off thing. The person says it there and it's finished, unless it's recorded or unless it's written down. It's still oral poetry. So one cannot really charge a person for what he's said if it isn't published, or for what he's said in a literary form. I suppose they could eventually, but as far as I know, it hasn't really happened yet. So the oral poet still has a kind of leeway, still has a way of getting across his ideas. And the other thing about the oral poetry is that the poets who practice this do it in their vernacular languages. They don't normally the language of politics of the democratic movements in South Africa is English. It's more or less everyone's second language. But in these cultural manifestations such as oral poetry, poets would speak in Zulu or in Afrikaans or in Venda or in Xhosa in their particular communities. So they are really addressing their communities directly. So it becomes much more complicated than a book published or a poem published. It becomes much more complicated for the state to get these poems. They can remove the people, of course. They can put the poets in prison, and I'm sure they have done that, I'm sure. But there are many of them, and while it's something that is developing, it's going to be very difficult to find every poet. And some of their poems aren't necessarily political. Some of their poems could be love poems. So it's very difficult with a poet in that sense, especially with this kind of poetry developing.